better turn my microphone on. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for your work this week. It was our first um, week where we had testimonies, and I still think conversation went really well. So I appreciate that, and I hope that we can continue that trend. I don't promise that we'll keep doing it, but I do think when conversation is awesome, it makes it much more likely to continue. So I'm going to interact with some of your questions here. I guess I can do that whole little signposting thing. I'm going to do it to YouTube this time. So when you see something like that, here comes some extra information. All right. So the first question here is, what effect did radio broadcasting have on the music industry? So I think one thing that started to happen when we did have radio broadcasting influencing our nation is that regionalism with regards to its influence on music started to be a little lessened. So at one point in time, we might have talked about the blues. We would have talked about Southern blues. We would have talked about country blues. We would have talked about Chicago blues. These are off the top of my head. And so the idea that there was a regional influence, Mississippi Delta blues, would have been really prominent and probably easy to understand. But once music starts to get broadcast nationally across the whole country, a certain genre of music, the influence of regional, impact starts to go down. So I can also think in my own lifetime, at one point in time, was highly controversial. Was East Coast rap or West Coast rap the best? And there was a distinct branding and difference in those. And then maybe even in the mid to early 90s, Dirty South type of rap. And so you might say, but Johnny, I just thought you said when radio broadcasting starts to happen, it decreases regionalism, and now you're reaching for a, fairly more contemporary example, in the 90s or so, and you're still saying regionalism existed. Remember, the point is not only that radio broadcast exists, but when the music is actually using that medium. And so at that time, mainstream success for artists, particularly rap artists, was not that common. Certainly had some moments where there were artists that, hit the top of the charts. But as far as, mainstream success compared to something like pop music or rock and roll or metal or grunge, those kinds of things, comparatively, probably not as successful. And then when the music starts to actually get broadcast and well known, then we start to see, I kind of am tempted to use the word homogenization of these particular art forms. And of course, there's always somebody innovating, taking the foundations of what exists and then doing some kind of innovation on top of it. And then the cycle rinses and repeats. So there is still regional influences of music, but once those things start to be broadcast nationally, they start to become, known everywhere. And so once they're known everywhere, what makes a genre, it starts to be, copied elsewhere and becomes mainstream. And so the regional influences start to diminish. Okay, that's one. Okay, so here we go with the second question. What kind of influence has radio had on my life? And I'm tempted to say that it's been a key influence on my life. And of course, I'm older than most of my students, and getting older than most of my students will be as I advance in this career. But there were experiences that I had. First off, I lived, in a more rural area. So I wasn't close to towers where the radio was being broadcast and didn't have as much selection or opportunities to be able to hear music like you might, diversity of the music that I could hear would have been reduced in those areas compared to something like, your major metropolitan regions, Chicago, LA, New York, Houston, Dallas, Seattle, whatever it might be. So in my hometown, there might have been maybe 4 stations that you could receive and receive, maybe one of them really well. And then the others, you would just hope the signal would stay. So to give you some example, I was always into sports. I played them, but more as a hobbyist. In high school, I played tennis, but no other organized sports. It was just stuff that I'd do pickup games with basketball and enjoyed watching baseball, those kinds of things. And so there was this station that would actually broadcast the scores of games every 15 minutes. And so I would go and try to listen to find out my team was the Cincinnati Reds, and try to find out, what they were doing and how they if were they winning that day, those kinds of things. And it would be very, very frustrating because the station would sometimes only give you reception half the time. And so, half the time, then when I would go and I'd be listening, waiting for the score to come across, that's when the station would lose its signal. And so I'd be waiting around just to hear the score. And sure enough, would come in just as they would say the Cincinnati Reds score. So just sharing that, as an example of how far the world has come. We're now to a point I get together with my family every Sunday, and they put the little ticker of the scores and they tell you where the football is and who's in the red zone and all these things for football. And it actually annoys me because I don't want to know the scores of the other games because I'm with my family and we watch my game, which is the Steelers, and then we have two other people that are also into different teams, and we don't want to know the scores of those games. We want to watch them without knowing the scores. So actually the information has gone the other way where it's too much, too frequent. So of course, radio had an impact on me with regards to my passions and interests and hobbies. But also, of course, I enjoy music, I songwrite, those kinds of things. And so much of what I liked as a young kid was influenced by radio, or particularly there's an obscure station that I could barely pick up that played, kind of new wave, alternative, postmodern music is what it probably would have been called in that day and age. And again, it was a signal issue. But when the signal was good, I'd try to tune in to that station and be able to listen to the music that wasn't really over mainstream radio, that kind of stuff too. So it did color my passions for bands and lyrics, those kinds of things. So music was the main way. A little bit also with my hobbies with sports is how radio impacted me. And nowadays, I guess I don't listen to it as much, probably only when I'm in the car. Okay. Okay. So next question, do I think radio is as essential today as it was in the 20s? Does it create the same sense of community? And I'm going to say no, I don't think so, because really there would have been, at that point in time, television and radio, I guess magazines, newspapers, those would have been the ways that we were interacting with the world and maybe perhaps developing a community. But nowadays, I just don't think it's as omnipresent. I think that probably a wide majority of us are still interacting with the radio while we're in our cars, but it's also possible that we're, connecting our external devices through Bluetooth and just listening to our already prepackaged either podcasts that we want to listen to or music that we want to listen to. But probably, some of us are still making contact with radio while we're driving, but I don't know that a lot of us are making a habit of having the radio on in our homes. Even in my own home, my wife's a Pandora user and I'm an Amazon Music user. So we are putting together playlists that we've either developed ourselves or they're like kind of an auto-generated playlist based upon some interest that you've expressed at that time. So I don't really think that radio broadcast is omnipresent in the way that it used to be in many homes. And you can even see from our documentary this week, having a radio in the home and scheduling your life around radio programs that would be on, and neighbors would come over, especially when radios were rare. They would have to come over because they couldn't afford a radio of their own. So it became a way of creating community physically in the same space in a way that I can't even really imagine now. I mean, can you imagine if you were to call up your friends and say, why don't you come over on Saturday? There's a great radio program. Maybe in some areas where, people are just those kinds of artisans, those kinds of things. But I don't think that it would probably be possible in today's day and age. So it's just one example. It's not to say that I don't think it's an unimportant media. I still think it is important. And I think that it has an impact on people's lives. And there are shows that people do tune into regularly, but I just don't think compared to the golden age of radio, we could make the argument that it is as influential now. Okay, so this last question from this last group is, do I have a community that I can rely on similar to Bob? So I can say that in my life, I can't ever remember being a part of a radio community similar to, the example with Bob. But I did have a habit in my home with my sister and I. We would listen to Casey Kasem's Top 40, and um, that took a few hours to get through the top 40. And what we would do is we would be cleaning while we listened to it. So it was a way to get the cleaning done, which was a weekly chore that we needed to accomplish while listening to Casey Kasem and the top 40. So maybe, it wasn't something I actively participated in. I've never been an active radio caller. I think my whole life I've made one call into a radio station, and it was probably when I was about 11 years old and was trying to request a song. But otherwise, I've never been active in that way. But yes, I've definitely been part of other communities, and it largely has happened since the advent of the internet. So some of my favorite musicians in I guess it would have been the early 2000s, is when I started to participate in some of the online message boards. I'm still a lurker in some sports message boards, those kinds of things. As somebody that is a hobbyist also with sound and sound engineering, I'm a member of several different sites or pages on social media, or subreddits, those kinds of things that have to do with recording sound, songwriting, those kinds of things. And they've been important to me, and they remain important to me. I would say that in some form or fashion, I'm making daily contact with one, at least, of those types of media as well. So through radio, not so much, but through the internet, definitely. And I do think that on the whole, I see those as a net positive to my life. Okay, so I'll put this on here for the conclusion. So hopefully the little signposts that I'm giving you are helping you a little bit, just in case you want to skip through any of these and watch these at double speed. But let me close with the same compliment. Thank you so much for your hard work. Thank you for the questions. I hope that, the interaction I give you and the feedback and the written work in class and, via these video messages, make sure that you know that I am present. I do care, and I want us to have a great class together. We're halfway there now. And so please let me know, is there anything that you would like in the class that you're not seeing yet? I can always try to adjust even on the fly. Okay, appreciate all of you. Thanks for your hard work.